the 4th of July, I don't know how it was in your family, but in my family growing up, that was kind of a big event for us. You know, there are certain points on the calendar, you know, Thanksgiving, Christmas, but the 4th of July was a big thing in our family, and we had lots of traditions. The little town I grew up in Pennsylvania, you know, most of my extended family lived there. My grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and so we would get together, you know, huge family gathering, and we did our own. It might have been illegal fireworks display. But we had a great time, and it was such. But I'll tell you, what I only came to realize later, to me, that the 4th of July was literally, it's about like cooking out and about fireworks. I didn't really understand as a kid what it was we were celebrating. I always liked it; it was a great thing, but it never really occurred to me, you know, what's the meaning behind this? Why would we do all of these things? The Independence Day sort of observation has been in my blood ever since. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to teach a class through Regent University over in Oxford in Britain. And it happened to be that the time I was there was over Independence Day. It's a little awkward to be in Britain during Independence Day. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. You know, they have ground beef, and I, you know, found some rolls. We were making hamburgers. And so I told some of my students, some of the people I'd met there, hey, we're going to have a little, you know, 4th of July celebration. Why don't you come over to my apartment? Suddenly, there were like 50 people there. Every expatriate was, we got together and we celebrated the 4th of July. I had a great time. But I want to think about just a little bit about what it is, in fact, we are celebrating. Why do we call it Independence Day? I mean, you know, sort of the gist of it, right? I mean, we're talking about, that's the day that we observe the separation of the 13 colonies from Great Britain. Okay, that's easy enough. First of all, I want to, just a little quirk of history. This always kind of strikes me. The 4th of July is the day that the Declaration of Independence was ratified by the Continental Congress. Now, it turns out that 2 days earlier, that same Continental Congress had actually voted to secede from Great Britain. So you could make an argument that the 2nd of July maybe is Independence Day. In fact, I brought this along. I wanted to read this quotation from. This is from John Adams. He's a signer of the Declaration, second president of the United States, a very significant person. But he wrote a letter. He knew the significance. That same week, he wrote a letter to his beloved wife, Abigail. And a quote from that letter, he writes, "I believe that this day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be celebrated by pomp and parade with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other." Yay. So he kind of invented our 4th of July celebration, except if you read the letter, he was actually referring to the 2nd of July. So he's right in being wrong. But in some ways, it doesn't really matter. So the 4th of July is the day they told the world what they were doing. And for me, that's plenty good enough. I'm happy to observe the 4th of July with pomp and parade. You know, for literally the past, you know, couple of centuries, that is kind of the way he describes this, kind of what we've done, right? I know in my hometown we had a 4th of July parade every year, and it was a thrill to go and see that. What he calls illuminations is what we call fireworks today. Maybe the exact process has changed, but in principle, we're doing the same sorts of things that he recommended. I can tell you, and that tradition is old. In 1777, the next year, in Philadelphia, they had a parade, and they had firecrackers going off, and they did many of the same things that we do today. So that tradition is obviously, it's a big part of what we do as Americans. Oddly enough, I don't know if you even care about this, but you know, technically, the Independence Day did not become a federal holiday until 1941. That, in a way, though, it doesn't matter, right? Because we had been celebrating this. This is such an important part of our American heritage. It didn't really require an act of Congress, right? So why did it take so long? Because nobody needed that. It was not a thing necessary. Frankly, in 1941, it became a federal holiday so that sort of everybody knew federal workers would get the day off. Like that's what that meant. It didn't change anything about how we observed the 4th of July. But as I mentioned, that day, the date, the 4th, is the date we told the world what we were doing. And we did that through this critically important document that I know that you know and appreciate as much as I do, the Declaration of Independence. And I want to talk about that particular document at some length here tonight. It takes a little bit of your time. The Declaration of Independence, in many ways, it captures sort of the essence of what it means to be America, what is different about our country, and what unifies it and brings it together. Because In the past, what has normally defined nations doesn't really apply in the United States. It's not like we have a single common ethnic heritage, right? I mean, what's it mean to be French? It has something to do with who you're born to, right? Whereas in America, all sorts of ethnicities are represented, always have been. In 1776, there were dozens of ethnicities in America. That's a very old tradition for us. So it can't be an ethnic attachment, right? It's not even a religious attachment. It's not like we are some kind of theocracy of some sort, because while Christianity was very important and predominant at that time, there were various flavors of Christianity present. And even as time goes by, even that becomes sort of multifaceted, right? So that can't be it. It can't even be language. I realize that most of us think of English as our language, but there were other languages spoken in the colonies in 1776. It wasn't simply an English-only society. So what does make America America? It turns out, I would suggest, it's the principles that are stated in the Declaration of Independence. That's the thing that defines America. And that's worth, I think, coming back to. It's a sad thing in my mind. We've gotten away from this in our celebrations. Like I said, for me in my childhood, 4th of July was fireworks and cooking out, grilling burgers and so forth. In the 19th century, it was very common in towns all over the United States for somebody, they'd have a parade, and they'd have a sort of a public gathering. Somebody, some prominent citizen, some public official, somebody would get up and literally recite the Declaration of Independence from beginning to end, so that everybody had that sort of reinforced for them. Why are we here? For these reasons. I will not do that tonight, by the way. You probably don't want to hear all that. But it would be a good exercise, and I encourage you. Maybe it's a few days before the 4th. If you get a chance, go to your computer or find that book that you have on the shelf and read through the Declaration. It's about 3 or 4 pages, in a book. So that's not very much. You can spare the time, and it's worth it. It's worth the exercise. This is going to sound kind of weird, but I do this with my children every 4th of July now. We actually read through the Declaration. They're sick of it probably, but it'll come back to them when they're adults. I'm not going to read the whole Declaration to you. Your children will come back maybe, hopefully, and read a portion of it to you. But I do want to focus on some key parts here. The very opening of this document, which, by the way, we call it the Declaration of Independence. That's kind of a shorthand. If you read sort of an original, like a facsimile of the actual document they wrote, the title is much longer. The Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. So even, by the way, let me suggest the title is important. The Unanimous Declaration, right? There's no dissent here. We are in total agreement. The 13 United States. So we'll talk about this more in just a moment. They didn't see themselves as creating a thing. They saw themselves as 13 former colonies separating from the motherland that had, in their view, been dominating them. They didn't necessarily think they were creating an America. They were creating 13 states. We'll talk about that some more in just a moment. But in that opening paragraph, they're going to give the reason. They're going to sort of why this document, why this declaration. The words, they're very, they stick with us. When in the course of human events, what a great way to open any statement, right? It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another. So they know something very important is happening here, right? We're about to make a separation that is not unprecedented in the history of the world, but is not a common thing, certainly. We're about to do this. We're going to tell you why. And I love how they put this. Why do you need to write this stuff down? Why not just do it, right? Look, the war's already started, you understand, right? The Revolutionary War is going on. Do we need a document? They say, look at this, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Because we care about other people, right? It's a decent respect for mankind. It's just the right thing to do. We need to explain ourselves. And so that's the opening paragraph. What follows is that explanation. If I asked you right now, if I go, just quote for me any section of the Declaration you could possibly remember. I'll bet many of you could come up with a few, at least some phrases out of the Declaration. Almost all of them are going to come from that second paragraph. The second paragraph is sort of the heart of the document. And it's broken down, really. It seems, in a sense, kind of wordy. It's written in that sort of that 18th century style, which I think is beautiful and lovely, but hard for us sometimes. We don't really talk and read that way anymore. But if you can break it down, it really has 5 basic statements in that middle paragraph, that second paragraph, which is, again, sort of the heart, the explanation they're giving for what they're doing. Why are they dissolving these bonds? Why are they breaking from Great Britain? They start with this phrase: we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, when I've taught the Declaration in a college setting, I would go, at this point, I have a wire so I can't, I would go right on the board, I'd write the word self-evident, and I would ask my students, who are mostly freshmen, I would ask them, what does the word self-evident mean? I'm not going to do this to you because to them it's a trick, and I don't want to trick you. Because 10 hands shoot up. It means obvious. No, it does not mean obvious. Look at exactly what the word says, self-evident, right? Literally, that word means, it's sort of a technical term in philosophy, it means the evidence for the thing is contained within itself. It may not be obvious at all. It might be highly obscured, but the evidence is contained within itself. A classic sort of example of a self-evident truth would be something like this: a bachelor is a male. Right? The evidence for that statement is contained within itself. Bachelorhood implies maleness, right? So when they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, they aren't saying we think these things are obvious. They're saying we think that the evidence for these things is contained within themselves. It's like saying this is the premise for our argument. We are taking this as our beginning point. No further explanation is needed because they contain the evidence themselves. So this is the beginning of our argument. And the beginning of the argument is beautifully, eloquently explained. Like I said, there are 5 statements which we're going to go through here and take a couple minutes to do it. They open with this phrase. So we hold these truths, there are 5 of them, 5 truths, to be self-evident. And by the way, if you ever are reading this yourselves, they're all indicated, you can sort of count them off by the word that. Every time you see the word that, we're introducing a new truth, okay? So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So understand what they're saying. The evidence for that is contained within itself. All men are created equal. The notion of creation implies equality, right? Because think about who does the creating, right? They don't actually say this here, but what's a created being? There has to be a creator, right? God creates, and compared to God, we're all kind of the same, right? None of us are God, right? So the stuff that God makes, there's a kind of equality in being created. Right, so the evidence is contained within itself. All men are created equal. But watch how they take each truth and build upon it. So the first truth, all men are created equal. Look at the next one. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So the first statement implies the existence of a Creator. The second one takes that notion of a Creator and extends it out further. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Again, so there's one of those phrases that might be kind of hard for us to kind of wrap our mind. What's an unalienable right? It literally means it can't be separated from something, right? So as a created being, you and me, everybody in this room, everybody on this planet, we are endowed by this God who made us with unalienable rights. They can't be separated from us. Now, so I have to pause here for a second because I would always ask my students this question too, and this is worth thinking about. 1776, we haven't gotten to them yet, but you know what's coming, right? Some of the rights that they mention. Does everybody enjoy the free use of these rights in the world? It kind of seems like they are alienated in many places. To some degree, maybe even in America at this moment, some of these rights are alienated. How can it be that these rights can't be separated? That always kind of stumps them because there'll be silence in the room for a few moments while they think, oh, I hadn't thought about that. But let me tell you, this is actually not that complicated. Could a tyrant, could a wayward king, could a king who doesn't feel bound by the law, could he abuse your rights? He absolutely could, but that doesn't mean you don't have them, right? Shame on him. He's breaking the law. He's doing something he shouldn't, but that doesn't change the fact that as a human being made in the image of God, you possess certain rights. In fact, that's how you know the tyrant is a tyrant, because you have rights and he's abusing them. It's another way of saying this. It's probably relevant for us in our culture today. Your government does not give you rights. In fact, nobody gives you rights. You have them because God made you that way. So that one little phrase captures that very important principle, right? Where, number one, right? All men are created equal. Number two, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Nobody can take them away because God is the one who made you that way. So that takes us, you see how they build, right? To the third statement, the third truth, that among these rights, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, you've heard this phrase many times, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's some controversy at the time of the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson wrote sort of the first draft of the Declaration. Some people will mistakenly say Jefferson wrote the Declaration. Jefferson himself only had kind of he had kind of a love-hate relationship with the Declaration of Independence. He wrote the first draft, but the committee, the committee of the whole, spent the next day, that'd be the 4th, right? They spent most of the day kind of editing it and changing it and kind of, really kind of bringing it to consensus. And there were aspects of that Jefferson didn't really agree with. In fact, he was kind of unhappy with certain changes to his Declaration of Independence. Look, I love Jefferson. I don't say that to disparage him. But in his autobiography, which he wrote years later, he did something extraordinary. He actually, in his own autobiography, which was hard to do in the typesetting of the day, he put 2 columns together to show the declaration that he wrote and the one that got ratified, and he underscored the changes. He wanted you to know, I didn't do that. Right? They changed that. He didn't approve of that part. But so, yes, Jefferson, he's a very eloquent writer, and that's why they chose him to do the first draft. And most of these statements that we see here, they come out of, they come from his mind and his pen. But here's one where there was some controversy. These 3 liberties that are mentioned, 3 rights, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the ancient common law tradition of England, there was sort of this 3-part notion, 3 rights, but the rights were life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson took some liberty there, changing property into pursuit of happiness. And some people who were, let's say, more traditional, right, that we know these 3 things, but that's not all 3. Like, you've messed that up. And so there was some debate about whether that should be changed, maybe back to, in the tradition, back to property. The argument that wins the day, however, goes something like this. The pursuit of happiness includes property, right? The disposition of your property, and when we say property, that means not just land, like anything you might own, right? So hypothetically, you have a library, maybe, right, that brings you great happiness. That's a kind of property, right? But it's also a source of happiness, you see. And from Jefferson's perspective, and some of the others, actually a majority of the committee, it turns out, they saw happiness as a broader category, right? So property certainly is a necessary thing. I might need that to secure my needs, to protect my family, to meet their physical needs. But there might be more beyond property that might be useful in my life. And so that phrase, which is relatively new, like we say that all the time, but that was a new thing at the time. That notion of life, liberty, and property as the 3-part version of rights in the English tradition went back, it predates the Magna Carta. Let me stress that. The Magna Carta of 1215, right? This is 550 years later plus. This tradition is older than that, and Jefferson sort of one night says, you know what, I'm going to call it happiness. So you can understand why there might be some controversy. But like I said, they take a vote and it wins, so they keep the language. But there was some controversy about that. But I like the change. If you're going to make a change, that's not a bad one. So we have 3 rights so far. 3 truths. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This might surprise you, but that 3-part notion, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is actually in ascending order in terms of importance. I know that might sound strange. You would think life would be really important, but that's not really how they conceived it. Life was a right, but a free life was even better. And a free life in pursuit of happiness and or property was better yet. So they actually saw these rights as ascending. The most important one is the last one. Even though today I think we think of life as sort of all we have, right? We live in a very material world, and we sadly, excuse me, sadly we think of not us maybe in this room, but many people in our culture think of our bodies as all we have, right? So life is simply all there is. And when life is gone, that's the end of everything. Well, that's not how they saw it, right? There are worse things in the world than losing your life. For example, losing your liberty might be worse than losing your life. Let's move on to the 4th truth. That to secure these rights, so you see how it builds, right? We just talked about the rights, what they are. To secure them, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So here, this is an important transition. Why do we have governments at all? Right? What's the point of a government? The point of a government is to secure these rights. The rights predate the government, right? If it weren't for, oh, you're a good man. I love David Gilbert, I really do. Thank you. Give me just a second here, I'll get back to this. I feel so much better. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. So why do we have governments? To secure the rights. right? As we just said, remember I said a moment ago, if these rights are unalienable, can't be separated from you, then why doesn't everybody enjoy them? Why don't we see all over the world, everybody has all the rights? Well, because governments might interfere, right? Somebody might interfere with it. It's unjust, it's not right, but it could happen. Well, we have governments to secure them. That's right. See, a government is here. What's its purpose? What's its chief end? What's its function? To secure these rights. And by the way, this actually, there's sort of two parts of this one. The governments exist to secure rights, comma, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So how do you know a government's just? How do you know it's the right government? It gets its powers from the consent of the governed, right? Now, that might take different forms. If you think about this for a moment. Up to this moment, right, this is 1776, up to this moment, these people lived under a monarchy. So, on July 3rd, did that mean that they lived under an unjust government? Well, maybe yes, right, because that's how you got to July 4th, maybe. But for all those, those many centuries up to that point, they didn't consider monarchy automatically illegitimate. They consider King George illegitimate, right? But they didn't consider monarchy per se the problem. So this notion of the consent of the governed doesn't have to be necessarily in the form of like a big election we hold every 4 years and determine who's going to be our governor and we're going to vote on this. That could be. That's one way to do that. But consent can be offered in many ways. I could consent by simply tolerating and living with the government I have. Actually, John Locke used the term, he called this tacit consent, right? It's not active consent in the sense I fill out a form or touch a screen at a voting booth or something, but I consent by not resisting the thing, right? So there's lots of ways that the governed can consent, but it has to consent, right? If there is resistance, if that body, if the people, if you will, are being abused and do not consent, and yet the government persists, it falls into the category of tyranny. We'll talk about that more in just a second here, but let me get to the fifth and the final, these self-evident truths. The fifth truth, this is a long one, so you might have to sit still for just a moment here, right? That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, right? So remember why we have government, secure the liberties. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. It's a kind of a mouthful there, right? But you see what they're saying. This is the climax, right? All those things up to this point are kind of interesting and helpful and insightful. I like all that. But remember why we have this document in the first place, because we're separating from Great Britain, right? We're in the midst of a war for independence. So getting back to the war, right? Here we are. The argument here is that this government, particularly this monarch, this king, King George, has become destructive of the ends of government. And so what can you do about that? What must you do about that? It's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, right? This is not sort of a, there's nothing illegitimate in what they're doing in their minds. This is not sort of a dicey kind of hope all turns out okay. We have the right to do this thing because the government has left. Not we're not the ones changing here, right? We're not the ones who are making really, at the end of the day, the revolution took place back in Britain, right? The revolution was this king who went outside the bounds of his authority, who became destructive of the ends of government. We're maintaining the order. He's the one who's changed it. It's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, right? So, look, we're not anarchists, right? Nobody's saying we have no government, but to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. We're going to replace it with something else. Now, look, this document, as you know, doesn't do that, right? This is not a constitution. That's going to come later. Actually, after a second try, right? They have a couple attempts at this, but this is not a constitution. It is simply an explanation for what. Remember, these are these self-evident truths, right? This is why we're doing what we're doing. This is really even just as we said, the premise or the premises, the 5 premises of the argument. In a sense, this isn't even the argument. This is just the beginning of the argument. But these self-evident truths, they really do. These are the foundation from which the argument springs. And make a transition here. Let me explain to you something just briefly. It's really kind of what we might call a common law argument. The English common law, which if you think about it or know much about that tradition, again, it predates the Magna Carta. It's centuries old in England at the time. the English common law system is an unwritten kind of legal system, right? It's not based on a code like Hammurabi's code or Justinian's code in the ancient world, right? But it was an unwritten body of law, right, that was sort of interpreted by judges, right? But the idea was that it sort of existed outside of ourselves. We didn't make it, it just is, right? And you can trace this all the way back. I mean, this goes back into the mists of history where it's hard, where nobody wrote things down. Like in the age of King Alfred, who, we're talking way back then, right? Alfred is the one who, I remember the Vikings, right? The Vikings were always visiting the British Isles, not in a nice way. Alfred was the one who first kind of organized and brought that back then the Angles together into one sort of body, because before that they were just a bunch of independent tribes and families who were very susceptible to Vikings, right? The Vikings were organized, these families were not, but Alfred brought organization to them. Alfred, this might surprise some of you, Alfred becomes in a sense, and people might dispute what I'm going to say here, he becomes kind of the first king of England, of a unified thing that we might say is like England, right? He's the first one, really. And successfully, the Vikings are essentially out from that point on. Hooray, this is great news if you live there. But so while they had that common enemy, the Vikings, to deal with, they kind of cooperated, okay? But now we've overcome that. The common enemy, in a sense, has been sort of dealt with. How do you keep the thing together? Alfred went to the one source that he knew that would have legitimacy or authority with all of the tribes. Understand, these tribes had fought before, right? They have kind of a tradition of killing each other, over small things, vendettas, etc. Now, okay, the Vikings are a problem, but okay, the Vikings are gone now, so could we go back to killing each other? No, says Alfred, let's not do that. Instead, he turns to the Bible. He draws a body of law out of the scriptures. And this is controversial. He actually translates large portions of the law into what then was the early version of English. Why they didn't burn him, I don't know. I guess because he's the king and he was powerful. But he actually uses that as his body of law. Look, so you want to know how we will behave here in England? This will be our code, if you will. But again, notice, that's not a man-made, that's not Hammurabi, that's not Justinian, that's not even Alfred, right? Alfred says, don't look at me, I'm not giving you the law. God gave you this law. And that really becomes the seed of this common law, which, as it grows and expands, they don't reduce it to words, right? They don't so much try to say, this is our code, and we're going to write it down for you. Yes, we have the Bible to look to. We have the Ten Commandments, etc. But even as it grows and takes sort of, bigger and more fulfilling forms, for them it becomes something that we pass on, because if we try to articulate it, right, if we try to give it words, try to give it voice, we can't speak for God, right? So the common law tradition, which again, that's way back, right? This is hundreds of years before the Declaration of Independence. But it was so woven into the fabric of English life that the colonists thought of themselves, they first of all thought of themselves as British, not surprising, right? But they thought of themselves as heirs of the common law. We have the same common law protections that everybody else does. If you remember, and I don't expect that you should, but if you remember the Magna Carta even a little bit, or why we had a Magna Carta at all, it had to do with a king, King John, who was frankly acting outside what they considered the bounds of legitimate kingly authority, right? He was compelling taxation. This is sounding even a little bit familiar, right? Forcing people to pay taxes against their will. This is his clever thing, he would force people to make him loans, right? Like if somebody puts a sword in your gut and says, look, you're going to lend me $1,000. Oh, okay, I guess I will. And then he never gets around to paying you back. But it was a loan. It's not taxation. That's the kind of thing he did, and he was kind of a tyrant, frankly. The barons get together. They gather sort of a little army of their own. They fight the king's army. They win. This is worth thinking about. They don't make up a bunch of limitations for King John to observe. They write down what had been their tradition up to that point already. In fact, there are a couple of spots in the Magna Carta where they use this language. They refer to the ancient rights of Englishmen that they're going to force King John to. In 1215, they thought it was ancient. I don't know how old it is. I don't know how old it has to be considered ancient in 1215. But it was. So it's been around a long time. And it's amazing to me, if you ever get the chance, it's worth kind of comparing the two, how much of our Declaration echoes what was already present in the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta, at least from their point of view, echoes what came, I don't know, whatever's ancient before 1215. That's a long tradition. The colonists did not. So, again, Jefferson, he's a great guy. He's a brilliant with a pen. These are some wonderful phrases. These are timeless almost. But what does he do? All he's doing is capturing a very ancient tradition, right? He's hearkening back to something so far back in time we really can't trace its origin. At least King Alfred, probably sometime before, right? These principles, they didn't sit around the night before, the evening of the 3rd. Let's make up some rights. We should have some liberties. What should they be? That was not their thinking, right? They were trying to capture a much, much older tradition. And I think they did a good job of capturing it. What follows, so I'm not going to do this, right? But that second paragraph, which contains all the beautiful phrases, what follows, depending on how it's set up in whatever the source you're reading from, is about 2 pages of essentially accusations against the king. There's a whole bunch of them. I mean, there's dozens of them. It starts off like this. He, referring to the king, right? He has refused to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. I'm going on. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people. This goes on and on. I haven't gotten to the most important ones, but they have dozens of these accusations. What has the king done? Let's make a list. These are the things that the king has done. I'll give you a couple of maybe some examples that might resonate with you. This is maybe 6 or 7 in. He says, they say, he, the king, has dissolved representative houses repeatedly. You might remember this, right? Sort of literally, some of the colonial legislatures, he would say, go away, you don't exist. Literally dissolving them. Like, I don't want to hear from you. I don't want the representatives of the people talking to me. Stop, go away. They don't like this. And this is actually, again, this is not famous, but this is one of my favorite parts. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing, with manly firmness, his invasions on the rights of the people. Don't oppose the king with manly firmness, he gets upset. I'm going to skip ahead here. Here's some more that are interesting and maybe, again, resonate with you. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislature. I'm going to sort of summarize. They have one where they take, they accuse him of, they have like a sub-list. This is like, points A through F, right? I'm going to pick 1 or 2 of them. He says, let's see, he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction of foreign powers, to our Constitution, and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation for, and he got a whole list of them, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. There's a long list, but you see how that echoes, that resonates, right? All of that, in a sense, is part of the Magna Carta, which is part of an older tradition, right? They see this as, these are the things that the king has done violating the laws of England, right? It's not that we've done something, right? It's not that we've grown discontent. It's not that we want to change. We want to preserve the order. We want to keep things the way they have always been. These liberties are so important to us, we don't want them to change. But King George has come along and he's changing them. Right? There's a revolutionary here. His name is George. I could go on, but you kind of get the point here, right? Now they kind of conclude, so I'm skipping through all the couple of pages there, this long list of accusations, each one of which, let me just say this, each one of which you could find the precedent for in the common law. Right? It's a list. By the way, it's not everything the king has done that they might be unhappy with. It's everything the king has done in violation of the common law. So having done all that, so they sort of list their accusations, right? They say, so first of all, let me a quick quote here. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. And that's not an exaggeration. Literally for about 10 years, they had issued a series of documents. They would hold congresses, right? They would hold, they'd call bodies of representatives from the colonies, right? All the colonies, and they would write to the king essentially and ask him to help. Do you know what they're doing? Starting with the Stamp Act, right? You remember the Stamp Act Congress? Maybe you might remember that from school. The Stamp Act Congress. This Stamp Act it violates our rights as Englishmen. Please help us. Parliament passed it. Wink, wink. But we know you as the king could make it go away. Would you mind making it go away? For 10 years, they tried in every way possible to get to the king, to have him do what a king should do, which is relieve the suffering of his people. But he refused. And they say in the next paragraph, this is great too, nor have we been wanting in our attention to our British brethren. They actually went a step further. They would go to public assemblies. They would take out, they would put articles in British newspapers, right? Directly appealing to the people of Britain. Do you know what your leaders are doing to us? Look, we're brothers. You understand, in some senses, literally, right? Those were family members who left and came to the colonies, right? So they're appealing to the British people. Could you help us out here? Look, we are being treated differently than you are, right? We're not enjoying the same rights you have. Oh, but the British brethren were no more responsive than the king was. And so they finally say, they too, the British people themselves, have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. So we're left with no choice but to depart, to leave, to separate. He says, we hold, I love this, we hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We're back to kind of a state of nature relationship. It's like any other foreign country, we think of you the same way we think of everybody else. Enemies in war, friends in peace. Leads us to that last paragraph, which again, sort of the soaring rhetoric kind of kicks up a notch or two in that final paragraph. I won't read it all to you because it's kind of lengthy, but you know it. You've encountered it many times before. But this is I'll read the last sentence because it brings tears to my eyes every time. For the support of this declaration, they say, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. There's a story that several of the signers actually told in various ways, but essentially lines up in each of the tellings. According to the accounts, as they were signing the document, the way they would do it, the presiding officer, George Washington, would actually read a name. Dead silence in the room. If you've ever been to Independence Hall, you can picture, right? They're sitting at these tables, right? That guy comes up, not a word, not a sound, just his footsteps, takes the pen, signs the document, goes back to his seat. Think about how long that takes. And then he says, the next name. Silence. That guy gets up, walks to the front of the room, signs. It's a very solemn moment. You understand what I'm saying, right? They know. Why is it so solemn? They know that if this goes badly, right, if the British win this war, for example, they are all traitors. Right? That's how history will remember them. So when they pledge their sacred honor, this is not a joke or kind of a clever phrase. No, their sacred honor is literally at stake. If we win, we're patriots. If we lose, we're traitors. And everybody knows it. And by the way, dead traitors, right? Because they'll kill us. In fact, we know the British sought to kill them. There was a standing order to hang any of them if they got caught. But there's one particular, the only time the silence was broken, I think I have the names right. I think it was Roger Sherman had just signed. And Samuel Huntington came next. Now, Roger Sherman was fairly short. He's about 5 feet tall, which, that's shorter than me. That's pretty short. And Huntington's a good deal taller. I don't know how tall Huntington was, but he was taller. Huntington sort of broke the protocol. As he walked past, because he had to walk past Sherman to go back to his seat, he said out loud, remember the stone cold silence, right? He says out loud to Sherman, I believe, sir, I have an advantage over you. Should the British catch me, I will die quickly, meaning he'll hang, because he's so heavy, right? He'll die quickly. He says, you will no doubt dangle for quite some time. You've heard the expression gallows humor? That's literally gallows humor. I tell you that story to emphasize the point. They knew what they were doing. They knew their lives were at stake. And if this goes badly, they are worse than dead, right? They're dead with a bad reputation. But it was worth it to them. It was worth the potential outcome, as bad as it might be, because should this go well, it's a new country in a sense, preserving an old order that is priceless. Just to kind of sort of wrap this up and pull this all together, let me just say it's worth looking at the document closely. It's a beautiful thing, and I encourage you when you get the chance to go back and read through it. You won't be disappointed. And as I said earlier, it's not built on ethnic identity. It's not imposed by force either. You know what I'm saying? In history, that's often the case, right? How do you get to be what you are? Because somebody conquers you and makes you that, right? That's not what America was. It was built on a body of ideas. That's an amazing thing under God's earth. the center of those ideas is literally, it is liberty, right? It's those rights that they say that come from God, not from us, that no matter what anybody says to you, no matter what anybody does, they can never legitimately be taken from you. That's a beautiful thing, and that's a heritage worth preserving, and it goes well with hamburgers and fireworks, so it's good to have on Independence Day.